It was supposed to be another sold-out night in Vegas. But halfway through his set, a police officer walked on stage and reached for Elvis Presley's arm. The band froze. The crowd roared. What happened next turned a moment of chaos into one of the most powerful nights in music history. Las Vegas Hilton, November 14, 1976. Nearly 20,000 people packed the showroom, the air thick with perfume, cigarette smoke, and electricity. Flashbulbs popped like fireworks as Elvis stepped into the light, white jumpsuit catching every spark. The brass section hit the opening of Suspicious Minds. The roar that followed shook the mirrored ceiling. He grinned, hips loose, sweat already shining along his collar. For 10 minutes, he owned the room completely, until something at stage left shifted. A uniformed man pushed through the curtains. Not security, not a stagehand, a police officer. The badge glinted in the spotlight. At first, the crowd thought it was part of the act. Maybe a prop bit, maybe a skit. Vegas loved its surprises. But then the man kept walking, straight toward the king. Elvis saw him. His smile faltered, just for a beat. The band noticed too. A trumpet cracked. Down front, a fan screamed, "Elvis!" The mic squealed. The officer, Sergeant Bill Riley, was assigned to keep fans from rushing the stage. He'd already warned the front rows twice. Now, seeing a woman climb the barricade, he signaled his men to pull her back. Elvis had seen it happen, and between lyrics called out, "Easy, fellas, she's just excited." That one line lit the fuse. Riley heard it as interference. Security froze, unsure who to obey, the king of rock and roll or the man with the badge. Elvis kept singing, but tension thickened around him like smoke. Riley strode forward, waving for the music to stop. The drummer looked at the colonel off stage. The colonel motioned frantically, "Keep playing." Then Riley stepped onto the stage itself. The band went silent. 20,000 voices fell to whispers. Elvis turned, breathing hard, eyes wide but steady. "Evening, officer," he said into the mic, trying for humor. A few nervous laughs rippled through the hall. Riley reached for his arm. "Mr. Presley, step down!" The words hit like a cymbal crash. Fans in the balcony gasped. Someone shouted, "Don't you touch him!" Another voice yelled, "Leave him alone!" Elvis didn't move. He just looked at the man's hand on his sleeve, then back at the crowd, as if deciding who he really belonged to. The seconds stretched. You could hear the hum of the amps. A camera flash went off, freezing both men in white light, the king and the law, face to face. And in that instant, something strange happened. Elvis smiled, not arrogance, calm. He leaned toward the mic and said softly, "Ladies and gentlemen, seems we've got ourselves a duet tonight." Laughter rippled through the room, shaky but real. The tension cracked just a little. Riley's jaw clenched. "Sir, please step aside." Elvis didn't. "I respect what you do." "Son," he said, still smiling. "But these folks came to hear music, not orders." A roar went up, half cheer, half plea. Riley hesitated. For a split second, even he looked unsure of what to do next. Then Colonel Parker rushed out from the wings, whispering urgently in Riley's ear. The officer lowered his hand but didn't leave. The crowd buzzed, restless, confused. Elvis looked over the audience. Mothers clutching cameras, soldiers on leave, teenagers holding souvenir scarves, and his expression softened. He said quietly, "It's all right, y'all. Everybody's just doing their job." The lights dimmed. The band waited for his cue, but instead of starting the next song, he stepped closer to the mic. "If they ever take me off this stage," he said with a grin, "I'll just sing from the jailhouse." The room exploded. Cheers, whistles, stamping feet. The energy flipped from fear to euphoria in a single breath. Behind him, the brass hit again, quick and sharp. Elvis launched straight into Lordy Miss Claudie, the lyrics rolling like thunder. Riley stayed frozen where he was, until finally, even he began to smile. But deep in that roar, under the bright lights and glitter, no one yet knew the night wasn't over. The moment that began as confrontation was about to turn into legend. What would you have done, standing there in his place? Walked away, or kept singing? The brass faded, but the tension didn't. Under the stage lights, sweat ran down Elvis's temple like silver threads. He kept singing, but his eyes never left the officer at stage right. Sergeant Bill Riley stood stiff, one hand resting on his belt, torn between duty and disbelief. He hadn't planned on becoming part of the show, certainly not this one. Down in the pit, camera shutters clicked in bursts. A few fans were crying, others were shouting, "Let him sing!" The noise pressed against the walls until the sound crew couldn't even hear their headsets. Elvis finished the last line of Lordy Miss Claudie, let the cord hang, and lifted a hand. The band cut off instantly. Silence. Then, softly, into the mic. "Folks, this man here's just keeping everybody safe. Ain't that right, officer?" Riley didn't answer. The pause stretched so long the audience started murmuring again. Elvis stepped closer. "You see, sometimes we all get carried away. Me? You? Her?" He pointed gently toward the woman who'd been pulled from the barricade earlier. "We all mean well." For a moment, compassion replaced confusion. The crowd quieted. The woman wiped her eyes. Even Riley's shoulders dropped an inch. Then someone from the balcony shouted, "We love you, Elvis!" And the spell broke. Hundreds joined in, chanting his name, clapping in rhythm. The balcony shook. Security panicked. Parker waved his arms backstage. Riley signaled again for calm, but the crowd only got louder. Elvis turned back to him and said, low enough that only the front row could hear, "You're losing them, son." "Let me fix it," he faced the audience. "All right, everybody, listen up." The room went still in seconds. He had them again, completely. "I think we forgot what tonight's about," he said. "We came here for music, not madness." His voice softened. "Let's start fresh." He looked back at the officer, eyes kind but firm. "You stay right there, partner. This one's for both of us." He gave the band a quick nod. A single snare hit. Then the horns burst alive as he launched into "Don't Be Cruel." The first line came out steady, confident. "You know I can be found, sitting home all alone." The crowd screamed in relief. Riley froze again, caught between a laugh and a sigh. Mid-song, Elvis danced his way across the stage toward him, cape flaring like lightning. He stopped just inches away, microphone in hand. "Come on, officer," he said, smiling wide. "You ever dance in uniform?" The crowd roared. Riley shook his head, red-faced, but grinning now. Elvis winked, spun away, and the tension finally shattered. Laughter rolled through the room. The music swelled. For the first time all night, fear turned into joy. Up in the control booth, the sound engineer whispered, "He just saved the show," because he had. Elvis had turned confrontation into connection. Law and legend sharing the same stage, both doing their jobs, both keeping the peace. When the final chord hit, he raised his hand again. "See?" he told the crowd, breathless but smiling. "Everybody's safe. Nobody's hurt. That's how we do it in Vegas." The applause thundered so long it shook the chandeliers. Riley nodded once, half salute, half apology, and stepped back into the shadows. But backstage, Colonel Parker wasn't smiling. He knew that moment, the king defying fear with charm, would ripple far beyond this room. And before the night was over, something even bigger would test that calm again. What happens when the law tries to leave the stage? But the story refuses to end. For a few minutes, it felt like peace had returned. The brass shimmered. Fans clapped in rhythm again. Elvis flashed that easy grin, the one people swore could stop wars. But backstage, something else was unraveling. Security radio chatter hissed through the headsets. "We've got officers saying Presley interfered with police conduct." The words rippled like static fire. Colonel Tom Parker heard it first. He crushed his cigar under his shoe and barked, "Nobody touches him! Nobody!" Out front, Elvis was finishing the last chorus of "Don't Be Cruel." Sweat sparkled under the spotlights. He tossed a scarf into the crowd, laughed as hands reached for it. The woman who'd started the chaos caught it and began to cry. Then out of nowhere, the house lights blazed on. It wasn't part of the show. The sudden brightness cut through the music like a blade. The band froze mid-note. A second officer, helmet off, radio still in hand, marched toward the stage from the far aisle. He pointed at the control booth and shouted, "Cut the mic!" The room went dead. Silence. All 20,000 people seemed to exhale at once. Elvis blinked, half blinded by the lights. He could see Parker yelling from the wings, his face red, his arms waving. Security closed in from both sides, but Elvis didn't flinch. He took a slow step forward. "Somebody tell me what's going on," he said calmly into the dead microphone. His voice carried anyway, raw, unamplified. Riley climbed back onto the stage, face tight with embarrassment. "Sir, we're under orders. You need to step down." "Orders?" Elvis repeated softly. "From who?" "Metro Command." The crowd started to murmur again, low, angry. People in the balcony shouted, "Let him sing!" The second officer called out, "Show's over." Elvis turned his head toward the audience. For a moment he looked lost, like a boy caught in a storm of noise. Then, slowly, his shoulders squared. He didn't argue. He didn't curse. He just smiled, that same quiet smile from earlier. He reached for his scarf, wiped his face and said, "Well, folks, looks like we're taking an intermission." The crowd laughed nervously, but they knew this wasn't an intermission. This was the end. Except Elvis didn't walk off. He stood at center stage, eyes sweeping over the thousands who'd come to see him. Some were on their feet now, shouting his name. Others stood frozen, waiting to see what he'd do next. Parker was shouting, "Leave the stage!" But Elvis shook his head. He took 2 steps toward the officers and extended his hands. Not in surrender, but peace. "I don't want no trouble," he said softly. "But if I go quiet, this place goes wild. Let me calm 'em down." The officers hesitated. The taller one nodded once. So Elvis turned back to the crowd, raised both hands, and whispered, "Shh." The silence that followed was unreal. Even the cameras stopped clicking. Then, in that hush, he said, "I've been told to stop singing tonight, but if they take me, I'll sing from the jailhouse." The line hit like thunder. The crowd erupted again, louder than before. Laughter, cheers, defiance all at once. People were stamping their feet. Some were crying. The officers didn't know whether to leave or stay. Parker buried his face in his hands. Elvis just laughed softly into the chaos. "Don't worry, y'all. Music's stronger than fear." He turned, gave a small bow toward the officers, and stepped down slowly from the stage. But even as he disappeared behind the curtain, the chant followed him like a wave. "Elvis! Elvis!" Elvis! The mics were dead, but the echo of that chant filled the Hilton ballroom long after he was gone. Sometimes silence isn't defeat, it's the start of something bigger. And before that night was over, the king would prove it. One more time. Backstage, chaos reigned. Colonel Parker slammed a clipboard down. "That's it. We're finished here," he shouted at anyone who'd listen. Reporters were already gathering near the loading dock, hungry for a headline that read, "Elvis arrested on stage." But Elvis didn't sit still. He paced, restless, tugging at his scarf, the sound of the chanting crowd still echoing through the thick curtains. "Elvis! Elvis!" Riley stood nearby, hat in his hands, guilt written all over his face. "Mr. Presley, I'm sorry," he said quietly. "It got out of hand." Elvis stopped pacing. "You were doing your job," he said. "Ain't your fault the world likes to make noise." Then the second officer, the one who'd ordered the mic cut, stepped forward. "Sir, Metro Command says you need to leave the premises until we clear the hall." Elvis blinked slowly, wiped his face and asked, "What happens to 20,000 people who came to hear music?" The officer hesitated. "They go home," Elvis shook his head. "No, they don't. Not like this." He walked to the edge of the curtain, peered out. The lights in the showroom were dim now, but the crowd hadn't moved. They were chanting, singing fragments of his songs, waiting, hoping he'd return. He turned back, eyes fierce but kind. "If I don't calm 'em down, somebody gets hurt. You want peace? Let me give it to 'em." The younger officer looked to Riley. Riley nodded. Let him. So Elvis straightened his jacket, ran a hand through his hair, and walked back toward the stage. The moment the audience saw him, the roar was deafening. The lights flickered, the cameras flashed, and then, just like that, he raised one hand. Silence. He took the unplugged mic in his other hand, even though it wasn't connected, and said, I ain't here to fight, folks. Nobody's in trouble tonight. The crowd hushed, hanging on every word. He turned toward the officers, who stood stiff by the stairs, and did something no one expected. He walked right up to Riley and held out the microphone. Go ahead, he said gently. Tell them you're just keeping me safe. Riley froze. Cameras pointed straight at him. The officer looked out at the sea of faces, tears, laughter, tension, and for the first time all night, he smiled. He took the mic, cleared his throat, and said, We're all good, folks. The king's not going anywhere. The cheer that followed nearly lifted the roof. Elvis clapped Riley on the shoulder, grinning wide. See? We all work better when we listen. He turned back to the band, pointed once, and the drummer hit a crisp snare. The brass answered with a triumphant burst. Then Elvis shouted, Let's make it official, boys! Law and music side by side! The band launched into Lordy Miss Claudie again. Riley stepped back, still laughing, shaking his head. Elvis danced across the stage like nothing had happened. Hips loose, cape flaring, voice booming through the unplugged mic. Fans were screaming, officers were clapping, and even Parker from the shadows couldn't help but grin in that wild, perfect moment. All the fear dissolved into joy. People later said it was like watching a preacher and a policeman trade prayers. Others said it felt like forgiveness made visible. Halfway through the song, Elvis pointed toward the woman who'd caused the commotion earlier. The one who'd been pulled back by security. This one's for you, sweetheart, he said. Don't let nobody tell you music ain't worth fighting for. She covered her face and sobbed as the crowd around her cheered her name. The final chorus hit like thunder. Elvis threw his head back, voice full and raw. Oh, baby, that's all right. When the song ended, he didn't bow. He simply looked at Riley again, nodded once and said, Thanks for keeping me honest. The crowd was on its feet. No one wanted to leave. Riley saluted. Elvis returned it playfully, lifting the mic like a badge of his own. That night, two kinds of authority shared one stage, the law and the legend, and for a brief, golden moment, they understood each other. As the applause thundered and the curtain closed, Riley turned to a fellow officer and whispered, He didn't break the law. He reminded us why we made it. Outside, the neon lights of the Hilton blinked like stars. Fans spilled into the street, still singing the song that ended the chaos. And backstage, Elvis finally sat down, smiled at Parker, and said, See, Colonel, sometimes peace don't come from silence, it comes from harmony. He laughed softly, wiped the sweat from his face, and whispered one word under his breath, Amen. When the curtain finally dropped, the room still shook. People outside the Hilton could hear the echoes from the showroom, 20,000 voices chanting one name long after the band had stopped playing. Backstage smelled of sweat, smoke, and victory. Elvis sat on a folding chair, head bowed, cape half slipped from his shoulders. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the flood of adrenaline. Colonel Parker stormed in first. You almost gave me a heart attack, boy, he barked. Do you realize what could have happened out there? Elvis didn't look up. Yeah, he said quietly. It could have ended without a song. Parker opened his mouth, then closed it again. There wasn't much you could say to that. The officers entered a few minutes later. Reporters followed like vultures, but Elvis motioned for privacy. Riley stepped forward, hat in hand. His voice cracked slightly. Mr. Presley, I owe you an apology. I let my badge talk louder than my sense. Elvis stood slow and calm. He wasn't angry. If anything, he looked tired, older than his 41 years. He put a hand on the man's shoulder. You kept folks safe, he said. That's all any of us are trying to do. Riley blinked. You're not mad? Elvis smiled faintly. Son, I've had people pull guns on me. A microphone's nothing. They both laughed. The tension dissolved. In the corner, a cameraman quietly filmed the handshake. That grainy clip would play on the evening news across America under the headline, "Elvis diffuses chaos with compassion." Outside, the crowd refused to leave until someone confirmed he was all right. So Parker walked out with the band and raised his hands. "He's fine," he shouted. "He says thank you." Cheers erupted down the strip. Taxi drivers honked their horns. Casino lights flickered brighter, as if the whole city exhaled at once. Back inside, Elvis reached for his water bottle, took a sip, and said to Riley, "Tell your bosses I ain't pressing charges, unless they want me to sing at the precinct." Riley laughed again, easier this time. "You're welcome any time, sir. Preferably unarrested." Someone brought in a Polaroid camera. They posed together, Elvis in his rhinestone suit, Riley still red-faced and smiling. The flash popped. The photo developed into a blur of white, blue, and forgiveness. A month later, that same photo would hang in the Las Vegas Police Department break room, with a note scribbled across the bottom in blue ink. "Thanks for keeping the peace." EP news outlets ran the story for days. Letters poured into Graceland from fans around the world. "You showed the world that kindness wins." One even came from a police academy in Texas. "We're using your Vegas show as a case study in de-escalation." Elvis laughed when he read that. "Guess I finally passed something without studying," he said. But beneath the humor, he was thoughtful. He started arriving early to venues, personally greeting local officers, shaking hands, calling them partners. He told his crew, "No more shouting at security. We set the tone." Because he'd learned something that night, that authority and art didn't have to collide. They could coexist. When asked by a reporter what he'd remember most from that show, he said simply, "The look on that man's face when he realized we were on the same side." The interviewer pressed, "You mean the officer?" Elvis smiled. "No, the whole crowd." Outside, the desert wind carried the last of the cheers down the strip, scattering them into the warm November night. And somewhere in that sound, half thunder, half hymn, you could almost hear the start of something new. Respect, set to rhythm. But the story didn't end in Vegas. The moment that began with a near arrest would follow him across every city he played next, reshaping the way the king met the world. The Vegas show was supposed to be a headline for 1 week, but it followed him everywhere. By December 1976, newspaper clippings were pinned backstage at nearly every tour stop. Elvis turns near arrest into peace. The king calms chaos with a smile. He didn't chase the fame from it. He carried the lesson instead. On a cold night in St. Louis, just before walking on stage, Elvis turned to his band and said quietly, "No matter what happens out there, we meet anger with music." Understood. They nodded. That became his creed. From then on, every show began the same way. The lights dimmed, the orchestra hushed, and Elvis stepped into the spotlight, not with a rock anthem, but with a gospel song. Sometimes Peace in the Valley, sometimes Help Me. Audiences didn't expect it, but they never forgot it. Las Vegas Hilton, February 1977. 15,000 people packed the room. A hush fell as he sang, "Oh Lord, help me to stand." No one moved. No one coughed. You could hear the tap of his boot heel against the stage. When the final note faded, he smiled softly and said, "All right, now we can rock." The crowd erupted. It became a ritual, not a performance trick, but a message. He was reminding them what music was for. Riley came to see him again that spring, this time in Memphis. Elvis spotted him near the front, still in uniform, and stopped mid-show. He grinned and said into the mic, "Well, look who's back, my favorite lawman." The crowd laughed. Elvis took off his guitar pick and walked to the edge of the stage. He handed it to the officer personally. "For the man who reminded me that music and law ain't enemies," he said. The audience rose to their feet, applauding not just for Elvis, but for what the moment stood for. That pick still sits framed in a Memphis precinct lobby today. Beneath it reads, "Presented by Elvis Presley, February 1977, for peace." By then, people had stopped seeing him as just the king. He'd become something gentler, wiser, a man trying to make every show a bridge instead of a spotlight. He started closing each concert with a few words instead of just a bow. "Take care of each other out there," he'd say. "The world's mean enough without us adding to it." Even Colonel Parker, once skeptical, began calling it the Harmony Tour. The press noticed too. Rolling Stone wrote, "Presley has traded swagger for serenity, and somehow it suits him." But the biggest change wasn't on stage, it was off. He began visiting hospitals after shows, slipping in unannounced. He'd hum softly in children's wards, leave notes for nurses that simply read, "Thank you for keeping people safe." He donated anonymously to police charities across Tennessee. He even paid for the widow of a fallen officer to keep her home. No publicity, no press, just quiet kindness. Those close to him said that Vegas night had humbled him in a way no career setback ever could. One bandmate, Glenn D. Harden, said later, after that, he stopped trying to prove he was the king. He just wanted to prove he was good. And maybe that's why his voice changed too. When he recorded "He Touched Me" later that year, the take was raw, trembling, human. The studio engineer swore it sounded like confession turned into melody. He won a Grammy for it, his first for gospel, not rock. When the news came, Elvis just smiled. Guess heaven's got better taste than the charts. The applause, the lights, the fame, they all began to matter less. What mattered now was peace. He'd gone from being the rebel who shook his hips to the man who taught a crowd to breathe. And yet, one more quiet echo from that Vegas night still waited. A final symbol of everything he'd learned, carved not in sound, but in stone. Years passed, the Vegas stage lights dimmed, but the story of that night never did. Long after Elvis was gone, people still whispered about the show where the law tried to stop the music. Bootleg tapes circulated, labeled in neat handwriting, "The Vegas Arrest Show, November 14, 1976. The recording crackled with static, but you could still hear it, that roar of 20,000 voices when he turned conflict into harmony. At the Las Vegas Hilton, the ballroom where it happened was eventually renamed. The original stage was replaced, the curtains changed, but the legends stayed. And near the edge of the new platform, mounted into polished wood, sits a small bronze plaque. In honor of the night, Elvis Presley taught us that peace can be louder than anger. No neon fanfare, no signature, just that single line. Tour guides point it out quietly, as if it's a secret between those who still believe in grace. Retired officers visit sometimes. One of them, grey-haired and slow-moving, likes to touch the plaque before leaving. It's Bill Riley. He still wears his badge, but it's dulled with time. In interviews, when people ask about that night, he doesn't brag. He just smiles and says, "I thought I was doing my job. Turns out, he was doing mine too." The story outgrew Vegas. Police academies started using the footage as an example of calm under pressure. Choirs began singing "Peace in the Valley" to open their concerts in his memory. Even now, on the anniversary, fans gather near that old Hilton wall with candles and portable speakers. They play that rough bootleg, his voice echoing through distortion, and sing along softly like a prayer. A woman named Margaret, who says she was in the front row that night, brings her granddaughter every year. She holds up her phone flashlight like the stage light that once found him and says, "This is where music won, because that's what it was, not rebellion, not spectacle, but mercy." Elvis had faced a badge and chose compassion. He had faced noise and answered with harmony, and in doing so, he reminded the world that kindness, like music, travels farther than anger ever will. There's a saying among old Vegas locals, "The king left the building, but the peace stayed." Every note he sang after that night, every gentle joke, every soft thank you on stage, it all traced back to one decision: to choose understanding over pride. Even his final shows carried that echo. He'd end with the same words: take care of each other out there. Simple, human, true. Today, the bootleg recording has been restored digitally. It lasts exactly 12 minutes and 14 seconds, but for those who listen closely, it holds more than music. You can hear the crowd gasp, the tension crack, the moment the badge meets the king, and grace wins. Maybe that's the real legacy. Not the records, not the jumpsuits, not even the fame, but the proof that one calm voice, even when the world tells it to stop, can change the sound of history. And if you ever stand in that ballroom, when the lights are low and the air is still, you might swear you hear him again. A soft hum deep in the silence, a single note that says, peace. When the world gets loud, remember this story. The night a man with a microphone chose peace instead of pride. If you were there, tell someone. If you weren't, share it anyway. Because every generation needs to know, even when the music stops, grace can still keep playing.